All right, everybody, welcome back to the Adventure RX podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Anderson, physical therapist, endurance athlete, big skier. Today I have on my friend, Dr. Jimmy Moley, who is the proud owner of the Jimmy Moley MD Adult and Sports Psychiatry out in Independence, Ohio. I met Jimmy recently this month. I think we're going to have a very, very interesting chat today. As we were talking about before we got on here, a lot of overlap between the physical and the psychological side of things, especially with return to sport athletes. I'm sure we'll dive into that in detail. But Jimmy, thank you so much for your time today. I'm super excited for this chat, and I think our patients are going to get a lot out of this.
Thank you so much for having me on. Excited to get into it.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your practice, where you're located, what you're all about out there.
Absolutely. So I am an adult and sports psychiatrist with a solo private practice in Independence, Ohio. And I treat really a mix of high-level athletes ranging from the high school to professional and Olympic levels, and as well as general population, which tends to be, as I'm sure we'll talk about, a fair amount of executives and higher performing individuals. So I do both medication management, psychotherapy services, and really try to provide pretty holistic mental health care. So the practice has been open now for nearly 2 years, and really excited just to see everything grow and serve the mental health needs of the community.
I love that. That's super exciting. You've been open for a couple of years. Now, for the layman person, what is the difference between a psychologist and psychiatry?
Yeah, that's a good question. So from my side, a psychiatrist is someone who takes maybe more of a medical approach, right? So I went through training in medical school at Ohio State, and from there you subspecialize, right? So people can become orthopedic surgeons, cardiologists, right, et cetera. So I chose to go into psychiatry, and so from there, then I do a subspecialization in sports psychiatry. So I'm certified through the ISSP and working through the ABSPP's program. Psychiatry is more of the medical perspective, right? We can prescribe medications and kind of takes that more medical approach. Whereas psychology is, can come at from a variety of different backgrounds, right? It could be more of your traditional like sports therapy, right? There could be, sports social workers, all sorts of different people, different backgrounds, and they take more of a mental skills approach generally, right? So it's kind of more of that mental training. Now, I have that training as well, so it's a mix of both, right? But some subtle differences that I think help stand it out.
Gotcha. What initially drew you to wanting to specialize in this field?
I went into medical school always thinking I wanted to work with athletes, right? That was kind of the one thing I knew for sure. So initially was thinking kind of the sports medicine, orthopedic route, but really valued that individual connection you can make in psychiatry. I think it uniquely kind of dives into that personal level and creates connections with the people that I help treat. So I was really drawn to that. And then once I figured out that I could do sports psychiatry, work with athletes, and, with the growing awareness of mental health in sport, I pretty much became a no-brainer and definitely no regrets. Really enjoyed doing the work.
Are you finding, as some of these big athletes are talking about the mental health side of sport, the one that comes to mind being a Clevelander is Kevin Love about 4 or 5 years ago. Had a really good piece he put out. Are you finding that more athletes are seeking you out or seeking out psychiatry in general, where it's, I almost feel like, it's like a manly man sport. I don't want to talk about anything, I'm an athlete. Do you find that is shifting at all in your field?
Without a doubt. Stigma has always been and still remains the number one issue that we face, as mental health providers in sport. But I think one of the most powerful examples you can give are peers, right? And people that, athletes that individuals look up to. So when those people open up, maybe share their vulnerabilities and their struggles, I think in a way it gives other athletes permission, right? To share that, to feel more comfortable expressing it and to seek treatment. So I'm sure will always be somewhat of an issue, right? Because of the cultural aspects that you mentioned there, but definitely improving. I think hopefully, we'll continue the momentum.
Yeah, I love that. I think even recreational athletes coming back from injury or surgery, that can even be more challenging in my opinion, because they don't have access to millions of dollars to rehab. They're maybe not getting the best PT rehab. They have kids, family, they got a job they got to go to, compare and contrast, I guess, someone or maybe the strategies that you might use with someone that maybe is it like the Cavaliers level or pro or semi-pro versus, the weekend warrior that blew their knee out in pickleball league or something like that.
Right. Well, there's definitely certain similarities. Right. So we're going to talk through similar stages of recovery if we're talking like after an injury, right? There's going to be shared experiences in terms of hesitation about recovery, beating different thresholds, right? How you kind of progress through the different stages of recovery and what that looks like. So definitely a lot of similarities. I would say a lot of the differences, kind of relate maybe to questions of identity. It's with maybe say a professional athlete, right? That oftentimes that a vast majority of who they see themselves as, and
Right.
has required a certain level of dedication to get to that point, which is kind of a singular focus. So when that is threatened or put in at risk in some way, shape, or form, right, with either an injury, maybe retirement, trade, free agency, right, whatever, oftentimes there can be more work to do in terms of how do we recover this? How do we kind of think about building back up and kind of see this in light of our whole personal life, right? Now, for a recreational athlete, right, they maybe have a little bit more identity development generally, right, in terms of they see themselves maybe as part of their family or different jobs or things in their community. So there's that. But like you said, professional athletes also have more resources available too. So definitely, a lot of similarities, but some kind of key differences that we like to.
Do you feel that? Which side do you feel like struggles more with recovery? Either the physical or on your side of things, more of the high level athlete or the weekend warrior?
I would say, unfortunately, it really does kind of depend on the individual, right?
Right.
I think some people handle these kind of things just differently than others, and that there's probably a variety of reasons for that, right? Past experiences, upbringing, things like that. I would say there are unique challenges faced by high-level athletes. Like I said, the perceived stakes are often higher, right? There's consequences that kind of trickle down in various forms.
Right.
But also, the same could be said, I think, for recreational athletes. So I would say the people who do best, regardless of what category they fall into, and I'm sure we'll talk about this too, but are ones who, kind of deal with setbacks well, right? They're maybe kind of mentally flexible as well as physically flexible in a way to kind of act with certain levels like fear present and work through challenges and kind of have that well-rounded identity that I mentioned before.
Yeah, I love that. Are there traits that on initial eval or the initial visit that you can pick out and almost predict that someone may do better than someone else if you're comparing two similar situations?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things, and I'm sure you see this as well, is individuals who maybe this is their first major injury, or if they've gone through a similar process before, right? That's a big differentiator, right? It's almost an entirely different skill set, right? When you do it maybe a second or third time.
Right.
So that's a big thing. I would say, we all at times struggle with mental health symptoms, right, at various points, but some more than others. So, individuals maybe who have been through therapy, who have been through different, mental health challenges over the years, I think that probably builds a certain level of resilience that can help. And then, the biggest thing often I talk about too is kind of support systems, right? And who is in that individual's life to help them. And it looks different, of course, by level, but, family support, community support, friends are, as you know, it's super critical in the recovery process.
Yeah, one of the aspects I talk about with patients, especially if they're post-op or if they're dealing with maybe it's a subacute injury, that we want to set up the body in a healing state. So it's the pillars of health, right? So it's sleep quality, it's hydration, it's balanced diet, the psychological side as well, stress management, and then general exercise recommendations. Where do you fall on the importance of all of those aspects of health with the recovery benefiting the psychological side especially?
Probably some of the less spoken about and maybe more underrated aspects of recovery, right? And I'm sure you see this as well. It's part of the reason I went into private practice, and it kind of gives you that time and that space to really explore these kind of things. I think there's some perception that psychiatry, you're going to get a prescription, right? And a pill will kind of fix everything. But we just know, with decades of evidence, really, that that's not the case. So I really want to focus holistically. How do we kind of build everything up? We know all of these things affect mental health and obviously physical health as a result. So how do we have the space to think about that kind of thing? And oftentimes, too, there's some work to do on shifting the mindset, right? I think there's some attitudes of like, well, it's, yeah, sleep, whatever, right? Or, we'll work on that later or after we get the more important things, quote unquote, taken care of. But really prioritizing that early on and creating space for that is very.
Yeah, I think the whole grind it out mentality, I think that's shifting a little bit, especially if you're working on psychological or return from injury. I think back maybe in like 10, 20 years ago, some of these pillars that we're talking about, pillars of health, certainly have not been discussed all that much. And I describe it as like the low-hanging fruit, right? They're easy concepts, but they're easy to change, like habit-wise. It's challenging, and it's not going to happen overnight. And different aspects are more challenging for other people. Like someone that's working 50, 60 hours a week and have a few little kids, like the sleep thing's going to be a little more challenging than someone that's 22, single, and has a little more free time.
It's kind of too, it's very foundational, right? Like if you don't get a good night's sleep, like we all know, we've all experienced that. Like
Right.
it's tough to focus, it's tough to maintain, recovery state, like all those sorts of things. So yeah, I think absolutely right.
Yeah, for sure. One of the aspects of injuries that is super common, especially with the recreational athletes that I'm seeing, is the fear aspect, right? It's the fear of the unknown. That's why many patients want to seek out imaging, seek an MRI to really, okay, what is actually wrong with my knee or ankle, and oftentimes the imaging comes back and it looks fine. And it's that fear of the unknown, the fear of the role playing, right? Like, I am a basketball player. I cannot play basketball right now due to the injury. Where do you see fear in your practice? What are your thoughts on that being a limiting factor, and how do you coach your patients through some of that? Especially maybe later on. I'm thinking like later on in the rehab phase when they're mostly physically looking good, their testing looks good, but there's still a little bit of that lingering hesitancy.
Super common, right? It happens all the time. And I think it really starts with the understanding that our nervous system, heals more slowly than a lot of times our physical tissue and physical system. Our brains are adapted to always protect the body, right? So I think it's a very natural instinct to feel that, hey, I don't want to overdo things. I don't want to risk injury. And I think first we have to recognize that and normalize it. I think a lot of athletes have this idea of like, I should, quote unquote, should be at level XYZ. I should be able to play. I should be able to practice or whatever the threshold is. But our brain, first and foremost, is designed to protect our bodies and to prevent injury. So that's kind of that first step. And then I think what we have to do based off that is a lot of reframing. What I mean by that is that, if you experience some sort of discomfort, if you experience fatigue, that doesn't necessarily mean re-injury, or that doesn't necessarily mean setback. A lot of that stuff can be expected, right? So how do we kind of shift that when you encounter that, what we're saying is fear? How do we maybe reframe that to say, hey, that, nothing is linear, right? Where there's going to be times when it's more difficult. And if kind of, it's going to take time, right? That's the other thing to reframing is not a switch you can flip, but I think that's probably the process that has the most sustained benefit over time.
Yeah, I agree. I think the aspect of peripheral and central sensitization of the nervous system is something that I educate with most of my patients, especially chronic pain patients. As we know, the central sensitivity just plummets, right, with chronic issues. And I word it differently than that. We talk about threshold and everything, more layman's terms. But yeah, I think that's the huge part of it. And just understanding that the rehab process is a bit of a roller coaster. I say like the stock market line, right? As long as we're trending upward, if there's some dips, it's part of rehab. I'm like, we're not a robot. We can't just take a part out and put a new part in. There's many factors that go into it, like we've been talking about. And like you're saying, some soreness, some stiffness does not precursor to, oh my gosh, I'm going to blow my knee out again. Especially if they're, looking good. They're a few months into rehab, and I'm thinking like post ACL. That's a roller coaster, that one. But like you're saying, doesn't always mean you're actually injured again. It's just part of the process. Are there any? So if we're moving from injury into more of return to sport and more of the performance, what's your definition of one of the things that it's in my almost in my slogan, it's maintaining active or maintaining healthy lifestyles. What is your definition for sustainable performance when you're talking to your athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very reasonable kind of global goal, right? So if we break it down, sustainable means that we're not just focused on the short term. We're not just focused on this injury recovery. We're really focused on skill building that will translate to future situations. I often treat injuries like a grief process. Right. So we're kind of, yeah, there's some acute event, right, that causes a setback. There's a loss of identity in a lot of ways. So how do we work through that process in a way that will allow us, when inevitably things happen again in the future, right, to be able to respond to that and to be able to bounce back. So that's kind of the sustainable piece, right? And then it's really about wellness in general, is, understanding that there may be times when we have to give more effort, give less effort, scale forward, scale back. Like you said, that grinded out mentality is really not sustainable. Like that.
Right.
A lot of times you see that as a result of injury. So I'm really thinking about how we tackle future challenges, how we build resiliency, and really teach skills through this process that will help in the future.
Are there any techniques that you give, because you work with some very high-driven individuals, whether that's on the professional side of things in business or the athlete side, and they're grinders, right? I mean, they're used to just going at it. And, oftentimes if they are dealing with a psychological battle or a physical battle, like we're saying, that grinded out mentality, like, often isn't the way to go. But that's what the mode they've been in for decades, potentially. What are some strategies that you use? Because one of the populations I work with are runners. And my God, man, like, I'm a recreational runner. I'm not a diehard runner, but you take running away from runners and it's like not okay. So it's that conversation with me and some of these very addictive sports. It's tough. So what are some tips or some examples or strategies that myself or other healthcare clinicians can use with some of these very high driven individuals when they are coming off of either psychological battle or working on an overuse injury or post-op surgery?
That makes sense. The way I like to do it is really kind of focus on outcome and outcome factors. So
Okay.
let's kind of take runners for an example, right? Runners, the process is running, right? But there's usually some, like, these are very outcome driven individuals, right? They're process oriented individuals. And the way I think a lot of this is framed is that they put a lot of effort into running to achieve whatever outcome or whatever kind of goal they're pushing for. We can say that we're aligned on the idea that we want you to achieve this outcome. So even though I'm about to maybe tell you something or give a recommendation that maybe doesn't totally make sense, I'm doing so because we both share the same goal. Now, what we may say too, a lot of times I often kind of reflect a bit and say, hey, a lot of times maybe this mentality is what put us in this position, unfortunately.
Right.
Using kind of reframing, again, that idea, reframing rest as a tool to get to your desired outcome. We've tried this other way of pushing 110% at all times, and it's led to some issues. Okay. So now maybe we have to learn from that. We have to respond to that with the same goal in mind. Realize that rest can be used as a tool, just like training, just like nutrition, just like whatever other factors you use as tools. Rest can and should be a tool to get us to that.
Yeah, I agree. I try not to use the word absolute rest with the active people, and it's almost adjusting, like you're saying, adjusting their point of view of, okay, maybe taking a break from running, for example, can be a very useful thing to calm down whatever it might be shin splints, IT band syndrome. But can we do other things? Maybe we find some physical weaknesses on your side of things. Maybe there are some psychological tools they can work on, some strategies. Maybe it's a good opportunity to work on strength training or mobility, whatever it might be. And I think shifting their mindset to, okay, they're not telling me bed rest, right? Because that's generally not the answer when recovering from an injury, but it's almost like retooling them with something new to work on, especially like the runners are the very high driven athletes where, like, if you don't give them something to do, they're not going to stop doing their normal activity. You know what I'm saying, Jimmy? Yeah.
Oh, for sure. And like, I really like that framing because it's saying, like, we have to try something different, right? Otherwise, we're going to, very possibly end up at a similar outcome down the road. So what else can we do while we're resting, right? And that, like you said, that kind of keeps that goal-driven behavior active, right? And it, keeps the reward systems firing in the brain and keeps people engaged to the point where, all right, now this makes sense. I can understand this. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I think it's a good framework to have. One of the big topics, at least the last few years in the PT realm, has been chronic pain. So, we got a lot of that in school. It was sort of the hot topic when I was in school 6-7 years ago. Chronic pain science. Dr. Joe Tata is really not a cool dude. I don't know if you know Joe Tata on social media. He's a PT. I'd say he's a pain scientist as well. Pretty cool perspective that he's developed. But I think where PTs and other clinicians in similar field might struggle is educating a patient that is in chronic pain about the sensitization aspect that we've talked about, but without minimizing a patient's experience, their self-experience, right? Because if I'm in chronic pain, someone tells me, "Oh, it's just in your head." Are you really going to listen? Like, okay, you're not actually listening to what I'm saying. Help me develop a strategy or two that we can develop in practice or use with these type of situations that doesn't minimize or like ridicule what the patient is explaining their situation to be.
Right. That's probably one of the more challenging aspects, right? Because I think individuals with chronic pain very likely have encountered many different providers in different aspects, right? These may
Sure.
be
Yep.
people who,
They've just
yeah,
gone through the systems, gone through different PTs, chiropractors, dry needling, acupuncture, massage,
yeah.
you name it.
And more often than not, right, a lot of those experiences are going to be negative, right? I think that there's still a negative perception around the chronic pain idea. People who, like you said, maybe have made even offhanded comments, right, that have a lasting impact. So
Right.
with that understanding, I think the number one thing is probably trust, is really establishing that you are someone who will listen, who will understand their concerns and, validate in a way that I think doesn't necessarily, kind of wash over their symptoms or make them feel as if, like this is all how it's going to be forever. Like we still want to try to improve things. We still want to engage in treatment,
Right.
but understand that maybe there are some things that need to change, but you've also had some bad experiences. So, a lot of times, this can take quite a bit of patience on both the side of the patient and the provider to really build up that trust. Because I think without that, I think understandably, a lot of patients with chronic pain are kind of have that guard up, right? And that's going to get in the way of recovery, of trust, of rest, of all the stuff we've been talking about. So kind of critical right off the jump.
Yeah, so many factors go into it. Are you familiar with the acceptance control theory with chronic pain?
I am, yeah.
So that's one of the things that Dr. Joe Tata, he explains pretty well. And it's a tricky topic. I think you can do it completely incorrectly where a patient just totally takes it the wrong way. But can you maybe highlight, do you ever use the ACT theory, the acceptance control theory with chronic pain patients?
I do. I think there's probably different flavors and different ways to incorporate it into work, right? But
Right.
I mean, I think the idea of acceptance and kind of the idea of moving forward and how do we deal with this, like it all ties into the general framework of recovery. So like I said, I typically tend to take a kind of more of a grief-oriented process. And
Okay.
if we're going to look at the 5 stages of grief, the last one is acceptance.
Acceptance. Okay. Yeah, I like that. I like that.
So yeah, there's tons of overlap there. And I think it's this idea that, maybe you have changed as a person.
Mm-hmm.
I get a lot of, and I'm sure you do as well, this idea of like, I just need to get back to like how I felt a year ago or how I felt 6 months ago. And sometimes like that's not going to always be possible.
Right.
And those experiences tend to, there's a psychological kind of idea that we tend to kind of glorify the past, right? And overlook, how the past felt. So this idea that, being more forward driven, building up an identity now as a person who has been through such an experience. Mm-hmm. And now how do we live with that? How do we thrive with that? And kind of reframe the idea of looking more forward.
I like that. I like that a lot because as we know with especially major injury, you may not get back to what you were. And a younger athlete, a high level athlete, they likely will. It's a good likelihood that they'll get back to at least pretty close. A 35-year-old athlete that deals with a traumatic injury that is, a 9-to-5er, who knows? It's a little bit different. But I think I'm going to take that in with my practice is that look forward approach. I like that a lot because I would say that my side of things perspective wise, I'm always saying, okay, let's try to get you back to where you were functionally, at least, or better than you were before functionally. And again, that can happen with a lot of athletes, but not with everyone. So I think almost like reforming that identity going forward. Maybe you will get better than what you were, but either way, it's going to be, you're a different person. You've gone through a different situation than you did a year ago, or whenever the surgery was. I like that a lot. Are there any mental skills that you use that might pair well with physical therapy patients, especially that we can take and use? Maybe it's meditation or breathing techniques. I think breathing is one area that I don't know much about. And I think there's a huge opportunity moving forward with that. Maybe a few different skills that we could take home. A couple of your favorites with patients that are recovering from injury.
For sure, we could start there. Paced breathing has been around for a while. Was really popularized by MLB pitchers as a way to really regulate what we call catecholamine activity, meaning like epinephrine, norepinephrine, kind of regulating that fight or flight response in high pressure situations. It's a way to, pretty quickly reset the nervous system in a way that, is not really visible to anyone on the outside. Many ways to do paced breathing. One of the ones I like the best, just because it's simple, is box breathing, which I'm sure many listeners have heard about. This idea that, you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and hold that for 4. So yeah, it's a quick way, like vagal nerve kind of hits the vagal nerve, kind of down regulates that fight or flight response. and really puts you in a nice kind of frame of mind, at least to be maybe a little bit less activated.
Yeah, so what you're saying is it calms down the nervous system a bit, gets some of the jitters out, whatever you want to call it, with that autonomic nervous system. So that's the part of the nervous system that you don't have a ton of control over. It's the automatic, right, nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is the breathing techniques can help down-regulate or help control some of that like tightness you might feel, especially like pitchers is a great example, super high leverage situations they're in, all the time. So very cool. So breathing's one. Do you have one more strategy?
I do, yeah. And this one's more broad, I would say, bigger picture. And it's this idea of graded exposure. Okay. So it kind of really developed with treatment of like the yips, right? Like in golf or, in baseball especially, right? That's a more common term. But this idea that the way we go about that is by breaking things down into very small increments. So some famous examples like Rick Ankiel, right? Different field goal kickers over the years, golf especially. But this idea that we take an action that's causing there's some sort of mental block. And this very well applies easily to recovery. And we really isolate small individual steps and practice those repeatedly. It's kind of like an exposure type thing where over time, you just become more comfortable. Kind of gives permission to maybe take smaller steps and not need to just really jump back into whatever's causing some distress. Similar, like to weight training, that you don't all of a sudden start lifting up, get a PR in the first rep, right?
Yeah.
Building up the things and using that same technique in a mental way, I think helps a lot. It helps kind of maybe reduce some of that tension around the recovery process.
Yeah, I think graded exposure can be compared to, let's say someone is healthy is more of that like progressive overload, where on the training side of the performance side of things is that progressive overload with weight training or with cardiovascular training. If you're injured or coming back from an injury, that's that graded exposure to just slowly get you back to the point where your brain's letting you do that motion, that activity with less discomfort, I guess we could say.
For sure. Yeah. I think a concept most people are familiar with from the physical realm. And if we apply that to the mental skills side, I think we have a lot of success.
You mentioned one thing, permission, right? Permission for these patients to do whatever. Where do you use that in your practice? I know, gosh, I would say 80% of my patients are seeking permission to do whatever they like to do, right? If it's running, if it's weightlifting, they just want the green light because there's some fear involved, like we talked about earlier. Where do you see permission coming into play on the psychological side of things, and then on the PT side, on the physical side of rehab?
That's a good point. I think permission flows directly downstream of expectation. Okay, so there are certain expectations that for an ACL at maybe the 8-month mark, right? I need to be at a certain point. Or I need to be able to do this, right? And that could be based on a lot of different things. That could be based on personal experience, what you see in other people, what you read online, right? So I think we kind of look upstream a little bit and say, all right, where, you're asking or seeking out this permission to do X, Y, Z. Where does that come from and where is it driven by? Because more often than not, it's driven by a desire, right, to achieve goals that we're in alignment with. So then it gets back to that discussion of like, all right, how do we reach with that in maybe a more healthy, individualized way? And maybe make the discussion, it's less about a certain threshold at a certain time as it is what makes sense for your own personal recovery. So personalizing it, maybe breaking down some of the preconceived ideas, which starts early, of course, right? And again, it kind of also speaks to that trust relationship that, you are the one. There's kind of a strange like power dynamic right between that. Like there's someone that has to give that permission. So understanding that maybe it's more of a collaborative process than that too, I think would maybe help kind of increase comfort in the process.
Yeah, I think the collaborative aspect in healthcare gets missed quite often. I don't think there's nearly enough communication between the orthopedic side of things, the psychiatry side of things, and then the physician side of things. Hopefully, doing what we're doing in the private practice realm, having these, these good and tough conversations with each other. I think going forward, I'm optimistic that, healthcare in this country can become more holistic, better connected. I think right now it's just so piecemeal where people are hearing different things and different narratives, especially with chronic pain patients. They've been through the gamut of opinions. Man, it's tough. It's tough out there. Where do you see psychiatry and physical therapy blending together in the future? Like, how do you feel like we could collaborate better? Other than chatting about, on a podcast, where do you see like the next 5 to 10 years where things are going?
One of the biggest things I try to stress when I have these conversations, right, is the shift from being reactive to proactive.
Okay.
I would say, Nick, like probably 90% of the calls I get, right, occur after some sort of injury, sudden change, some issue that's popped up. And it's oftentimes a crisis situation.
Right.
Or regardless, it's always after the fact. And I understand that. I get it. And, I can intervene and help and do all that. I think a reasonable goal, looking forward 5-10 years would be more of a proactive approach with mental health. How do we, maybe just across the board, different specialties, increase the conversation, using mental skills as a way to enhance performance, to enhance recovery, as a way, versus just always like when things go wrong. So I think that's a huge shift. It's a shift in mindset, both for providers as well as patients. But I think, just like, you look at an average team right now, how many different people are involved in the care and in collaboration and, different coaches, training staff, all those sorts of things. It's a similar approach. And I think we're starting to see that, there's some glimmers here and there, more providers being hired in different roles, but certainly a long way to go.
Yeah, I think there's a long way to go. I'm optimistic about it. I think that there's plenty of opportunity to have these kind of conversations and, start building, a trusted referral network, with these patients that, are seeking you out in these crises moments, right? And I think going back to the preventative aspect on the physical side of things, it's the same thing where I would say about right now, half of my patients are actually injured and half are doing maintenance plans, which I love. They're staying ahead of injury. Maybe they're a little stiff after a meet or a long run, whatever it might be. But I love that shift where we're going more into injury risk reduction, trying to build your system more resiliency, taking the recovery process more seriously. And I think that has really been catching on, especially in the recreational athletes, where, you're seeing sauna, you're seeing cold plunge, you're seeing massage and dry needling and cupping. And cupping back in the Olympics a few years ago got really popular with Michael Phelps, right? And then it was like the K-taping with all the volleyball players. So I think in the recreational realm, it's becoming more accessible for one. There's more people offering it that are skilled, and it's just more common. People with the longevity aspect, they want to keep doing what they like to do. So they're taking this a little more seriously. And hopefully on the psychological side of things, it starts shifting, in that direction a bit more as well.
Yeah, I would say I think there's probably more progress on the physical side. I'd say the mental has some more room to grow. But I agree with you. I think there's seeds. Yeah, I think some seeds and some reasons for optimism, but much work to be done, of course.
Gotcha. A couple quick hitter questions for you. What is one phrase, maybe it's a mantra that you use, one phrase that clinicians across the board could use more of with their patients?
That's a good one. I like this idea, and you kind of referenced it before with the roller coaster idea, but that progress isn't always linear.
Okay.
I think
Yep.
Whether it's mental health, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's physical recovery, whatever, there is going to be ups and downs. Like you said, we want to make sure the trend line is still pointing in the right direction, but understanding that there will be setbacks and preparing for that ahead of time makes a world of difference.
I love that. Yep. It's a phrase that I use probably daily. I'm just dealing with some of the frustrations. It's like, I get it. Mm-hmm. I've been injured. We've gone through this chapter together. Like it's frustrating. It's coming down to their level, and just understanding that it's a process, and it's not a perfect process. We practice science and practice medicine. It's a practice. It's not perfect. Bouncing off that one, what is one phrase that you hear? Maybe it's in the gym, maybe it's with PTs, maybe it's in the psychiatry realm that drives you nuts, that's a myth, that is not correct in the literature, a phrase that just drives you nuts and you wish that we just stop using it across the healthcare spectrum with our patients?
Yeah. A couple. I would say the one we've kind of mentioned is the idea of like kind of having to meet certain thresholds or expectations, right?
Okay.
I get a lot of people that come in maybe saying, use an example like having panic disorder or panic attacks, right? And like, well, when am I going to start to feel better? Or like, when do most people start to feel better? And it doesn't really reflect, I think, that this is such an individualized process, right? So there's that. And then I think more in the physical realm, and I'm sure you've heard this too a lot, is this kind of idea of listen to your body, and kind of more of that kind of more reactive approach of kind of getting feedback. I think there's a lot to that. And I think we want to make sure that we're identifying pain, discomfort, and potential red flags, right? But also, like, there's discomfort associated with a lot of different things. And I think I use a ton in mental skills training. Like, we don't want to run from discomfort. We actually, in a lot of ways, want to embrace it, work through it, and progress past it. Shutting down or blocking it out or seeking ways around it oftentimes just really increases the volume of the problem, and eventually it will just bubble up more later.
I think that can be taken with the physical rehab as well. where sometimes there is some discomfort involved to grow in a way
Mm-hmm.
to get through things. Good. Where can people learn more about you if they want to reach out? Where are you located? Give yourself a little shout out here, Jimmy.
Very good. Thank you. So my website is jimmymoleymd.com. And that website has all the information, phone number, location, all that. But I'm located in Independence, Ohio, licensed in Ohio and Florida. I do both in-person and telehealth, and really can address most of, not all, mental health needs. So always happy to talk to folks. We could do like an initial phone consultation, figure out, how we can best serve your needs. I think with this idea, stigma always just has always recommend conversations, reach out, learn more about it. And if you or someone else could benefit from some mental health treatment, I'm here to help.
Awesome. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for the time today. I learned a lot. Hopefully anyone listening gets a lot out of this as well. A lot to think about for sure. The perspective is always very interesting for me to, see on the other side of things sometimes. So thank you very much, Jimmy.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
We'll do this again sometime, and I'm sure we'll chat soon.
Sounds good.
Take care. And we're good.